What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected actors walks onto a morning show expecting a normal conversation, only to be blindsided by a host who seems more interested in tearing him down than having a real discussion? In just 36 seconds, George Stephanopoulos went from friendly morning television host to the center of one of the most shocking on-air meltdowns in talk show history. This is the story of how a simple interview turned into an explosive confrontation that ended with Samuel L. Jackson being escorted off the Good Morning America set. It started like any other morning show appearance. Samuel L. Jackson, dressed sharp in a dark suit, walked onto the Good Morning America stage with his usual confident stride. The audience applauded warmly. He'd done hundreds of these interviews before, promoting movies, talking about his career, the usual stuff. Nothing about this morning seemed different. George Stephanopoulos stood up from behind the desk, extending his hand with a smile that seemed friendly enough at first. They shook hands, exchanged pleasantries, and Jackson sat down in the guest chair. The cameras were rolling, the studio lights were bright, and everything seemed perfectly normal. "Samuel, great to have you here," George said, settling back into his seat. "Good to be here, man," Jackson replied, relaxed and smiling. The first few questions were standard fare. George asked about Jackson's latest film project, about working with the director, about the character he was playing. Jackson answered each question thoughtfully, adding little anecdotes that made the audience chuckle. He was doing what he does best, being charismatic and engaging. But then something shifted. George leaned forward slightly, his expression changing. "You know, Samuel, I have to ask you something that's been on a lot of people's minds." Jackson nodded, still composed. "Sure, go ahead." "There's been some talk about your age," George said, and you could feel the temperature in the studio drop. "Some people are wondering if you're getting too old for these action roles." The audience went quiet. Jackson's smile faded just a bit, but he kept his cool. "Well, George, I'm in great shape. I do my own stunts when I can. Age is just a number." George didn't let it go. "Right. But you're what, 70-something now? Don't you think it's time to pass the torch to younger actors?" Jackson shifted in his seat. "I don't think talent has an expiration date, George. I'm still doing what I love, and audiences seem to enjoy it." "Do they, though?" George pressed, and now his tone had an edge to it. "I mean, your last few films haven't exactly been box office gold." You could see Jackson's jaw tighten. The actor who had faced down aliens, criminals, and monsters on screen was now dealing with something far more uncomfortable. A host who seemed determined to embarrass him on live television. "Every actor has films that do better than others," Jackson said, his voice still controlled, but firmer now. "That's the nature of the business." George shuffled some papers on his desk, a gesture that seemed almost dismissive. "I've got some numbers here. Your last 3 films combined made less than half of what your films were making 10 years ago. Doesn't that concern you?" The audience was completely silent now. This wasn't fun banter anymore. This was uncomfortable. People in the studio started exchanging glances, wondering where this was going. Jackson took a breath. "George, I came here to talk about my new movie, not to be interrogated about box office receipts." "I'm just asking questions people want answered," George said, but his tone suggested he was enjoying this. "You're a public figure. These are fair questions." "Fair?" Jackson's voice rose slightly. "Fair would be treating me with the same respect you show every other guest who sits in this chair." George leaned back, crossing his arms. "I treat all my guests the same, Samuel. If you can't handle tough questions, maybe you shouldn't be doing interviews." That was the moment. That was when you could see something change in Jackson's eyes. He'd been patient. He'd been professional. But there was only so much disrespect a person could take. "Tough questions?" Jackson said, his voice louder now. "You're not asking tough questions, George. You're being rude. There's a difference." "I'm being rude?" George actually laughed, a short, condescending sound. "I'm doing my job. Maybe you're just too sensitive." The audience gasped. You could hear it ripple through the studio. Crew members behind the cameras looked at each other in disbelief. This was spiraling out of control. Jackson stood up from his chair. "Too sensitive? Man, you don't know anything about me." "Sit down, Samuel," George said, waving his hand dismissively. "You're making a scene." "I'm making a scene?" Jackson's voice boomed across the studio now. "You've been trying to embarrass me since I sat down. You want to talk about scenes? Let's talk about your journalistic integrity." George's face flushed red. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," Jackson said, standing his ground. "You brought me on this show under the pretense of a normal interview, and instead, you ambushed me with disrespectful questions and condescending remarks. I don't have to sit here and be lectured by you." George shot back, his voice rising to match Jackson's volume. "And I don't have to sit here and be insulted by you," Jackson countered. The stage manager was frantically signaling to the cameras, trying to figure out what to do. This was live television. Millions of people were watching this unfold in real time. George stood up now too, pointing his finger at Jackson. "You know what your problem is? You can't accept that you're not the star you used to be. Your time has passed." The entire studio went dead silent. Even the crew members stopped moving. Those words hung in the air like a bomb that had just been dropped. Jackson stared at George for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he spoke, his voice low and controlled, which somehow made it even more powerful. "My time has passed," he said slowly. "I've been in this industry for decades. I've worked with the best directors, the best actors, the best crews. I've earned my place. What have you done besides sit behind a desk and try to tear people down to make yourself feel important?" George's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out at first. He was clearly not expecting Jackson to fire back like that. "I've built a career on asking the hard questions," George finally stammered. "No," Jackson said, shaking his head. "You've built a career on being handed opportunities and platforms, and you use that platform to belittle people. That's not journalism. That's just being a bully with a microphone." "How dare you?" George sputtered, his face now bright red. "I've interviewed presidents, world leaders." "And I bet you kissed their feet while doing it," Jackson interrupted. "But someone like me, someone you think you can push around, you show your true colors." A producer rushed onto the stage, trying to calm things down. "Gentlemen, please, we need to—" "We're done here," Jackson said, cutting the producer off. He reached up and unclipped the small microphone from his lapel. "You can't just leave," George said, and there was something almost desperate in his voice now. "We're in the middle of—" "Watch me," Jackson said flatly. George took a step toward Jackson, and that's when things got even more heated. "You walk off this set, and you'll never work in—" Jackson spun around, his eyes blazing. "Never work in what, George? Finish that sentence. Go ahead. Tell me how you think you have the power to end my career." George's mouth snapped shut. He realized he'd gone too far, but his ego wouldn't let him back down. "I have connections. People listen to me." Jackson actually laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You think people care about what you say? You're a morning show host who peaked years ago. The only reason you're still here is because they haven't found someone cheaper to replace you yet." The audience gasped again. A few people even applauded, though they quickly stopped when they realized where they were. "Get out," George said, his voice shaking with rage. "Get off my stage." "Gladly," Jackson said, dropping his microphone onto the chair where he'd been sitting. "I'd rather be anywhere else than in the presence of someone so full of themselves they can't see how pathetic they've become." George grabbed his coffee mug from the desk, and for a moment, it looked like he might actually throw it. The cameras were still rolling, capturing every second of this disaster. "You're finished," George hissed. "I'll make sure everyone knows what kind of person you really are." Jackson stopped walking and turned back one more time. "Go ahead. Tell them. Tell them that I stood up to a bully who tried to humiliate me on live television. Tell them that I refused to sit there and take your abuse. See how that works out for you." Security guards were approaching now, unsure of what to do. They'd never had to deal with anything like this before. "Mr. Jackson," one of them said carefully, "we need you to—" "I'm leaving," Jackson said, holding up his hands. "Don't worry. I wouldn't want to be on this show for another second anyway." George was practically vibrating with anger behind the desk. "This is my show. Mine. And you've just made the biggest mistake of your career." Jackson shook his head slowly. "No, George. The biggest mistake was thinking you could treat people like garbage and get away with it just because you have a camera pointed at you. That arrogance, that entitlement, that's your mistake, and eventually it's going to cost you everything." "Get him out of here," George shouted to the security guards, his voice cracking. But Jackson was already walking toward the exit. The security guards trailed behind him, not really escorting him so much as following to make sure he made it out okay. As Jackson reached the edge of the stage, George couldn't help himself. He had to have the last word. "You're nothing without this platform. You need us more than we need you." Jackson paused at the exit, his hand on the curtain. Without turning around, he spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. "Keep telling yourself that, George. Whatever helps you sleep at night." And then he was gone, disappearing through the curtain and leaving behind a studio full of shocked faces and a host who was visibly trembling with rage. George tried to compose himself, turning back to the camera with a forced smile. "Well, that was, unexpected. We'll be right back after this break." But his hands were shaking as he shuffled his papers. His voice wavered. Everyone watching could see that he was rattled, that Jackson's words had hit their mark. The cameras cut to commercial, but in the studio, chaos erupted. Producers were running around, assistants were on their phones, and George sat at his desk, staring at nothing, realizing that what had just happened was going to follow him for a very long time. In the hallway backstage, Jackson was surrounded by makeup artists, assistants, and other staff members. Some were apologizing to him, others were asking if he was okay. One young production assistant approached him nervously. "Mr. Jackson, I just want to say, you were right to stand up for yourself. That was really uncomfortable to watch." Jackson gave her a small, tired smile. "Thanks, I appreciate that. I don't like losing my cool, but there's only so much a person should have to take." "He had no right to talk to you like that," another crew member chimed in. Jackson nodded. "People forget that respect goes both ways. It doesn't matter if you're behind a desk or in front of a camera. Basic human decency should never be optional." Back on the stage, George was getting an earful from the executive producer. Though the audience couldn't hear the conversation, they could see it was heated. George kept gesturing defensively, trying to justify what had happened, but the producer's expression made it clear he wasn't buying it. The commercial break was almost over. George had to pull himself together and finish the show. But as he sat there, waiting for the cameras to come back on, you could see the realization washing over his face. He'd pushed too hard. He'd let his ego take over, and it had exploded in his face in front of millions of viewers. When the cameras came back on, George's smile was tight and forced. "Welcome back. Well, that was certainly an eventful segment. We want to apologize for the heated exchange you just witnessed." But the apology felt hollow. It felt like something the producers had made him say. There was no genuine remorse in his voice, just damage control. Meanwhile, Jackson was already in a car, heading away from the studio. He looked out the window at the New York City streets, processing what had just happened. His phone was buzzing constantly, messages and calls pouring in. Some from concerned friends, others from publicists trying to get ahead of the story. But Jackson wasn't worried about the story. He knew what had happened. He knew he'd stood up for himself against someone who thought they could belittle him without consequences, and that was something he could live with. Back at the studio, the rest of Good Morning America continued, but there was a palpable tension in the air. The other segments felt flat. George's interactions with the remaining guests were stiff and awkward. Everyone knew what had just happened, and it cast a shadow over everything that followed. During another commercial break, George sat silently at the desk while crew members whispered around him. He could feel the judgment, the disapproval. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. He was supposed to be in control. He was supposed to be the one who held the power in these situations. But Jackson had flipped the script. He'd refused to be pushed around, refused to accept the disrespect, and in doing so, had exposed George's true nature for everyone to see. The show finally ended, and as soon as the cameras stopped rolling, George ripped off his microphone and stormed off the set without a word to anyone. He locked himself in his dressing room, refusing to talk to the producers who were knocking on his door. In that dressing room, alone with his thoughts, George had to confront what had just happened. He'd let his ego write a check his professionalism couldn't cash. He'd treated a guest with contempt and condescension, and that guest had called him out on it in the most public way possible. The thing about live television is that there are no do-overs. What happened, happened, and millions of people had just watched George Stephanopoulos lose control of his own show because he couldn't resist trying to tear down someone he saw as beneath him. But Samuel L. Jackson was nobody's punching bag. He'd spent his entire career earning respect through his talent, his work ethic, and his professionalism. And when someone tried to take that respect away from him without cause, he stood up for himself. That's what made this moment so powerful. It wasn't just about a celebrity losing their temper. It was about a person refusing to be diminished by someone who thought their position gave them the right to be cruel. George had started the interview thinking he could control the narrative, thinking he could ask provocative questions and make himself look tough. Instead, he'd revealed himself to be exactly what Jackson had called him, a bully with a microphone. The contrast between the two men couldn't have been clearer. Jackson had remained articulate even in his anger, making points that landed with precision. George had become flustered, desperate, reaching for threats and insults because he had nothing substantive to say. When Jackson walked off that set, he walked away with his dignity intact. He'd drawn a line and refused to let it be crossed. He'd shown that there are some things more important than playing nice for the cameras, more important than maintaining a fake smile in the face of disrespect. George, on the other hand, was left sitting at that desk, trying to salvage what was left of the show, knowing that this moment would define him in ways he never intended. He'd wanted to be seen as a tough interviewer, but instead he'd been exposed as someone who mistook meanness for strength. The young production assistant who'd spoken to Jackson earlier stood in the wings, watching George storm off to his dressing room. She turned to a colleague and whispered, "I've never seen anything like that before." Her colleague nodded. "Neither have I. And honestly, good for Samuel. Someone needed to put George in his place." It was a sentiment shared by many in the studio that day. The crew had seen George's behavior before, the way he sometimes treated guests he thought he could push around. But they'd never seen anyone push back like Jackson had, and that's what made this moment unforgettable. It wasn't just drama for drama's sake. It was a genuine confrontation between two very different approaches to human interaction. One based on respect and dignity, the other based on ego and dominance. Jackson had come to that studio expecting a normal interview. He'd prepared to talk about his work, to promote his film, to engage in the kind of light, friendly banter that morning shows are known for. Instead, he'd walked into what felt like an ambush, and when faced with that ambush, he didn't shrink. He didn't play along. He didn't let George's status as the host intimidate him into accepting treatment he knew was wrong. That takes courage. It takes a strong sense of self-worth. It takes the kind of backbone that comes from years of standing up for yourself in an industry that can be brutal and unforgiving. George had miscalculated badly. He'd assumed that Jackson would just take whatever he dished out, that the actor would swallow his pride for the sake of the promotional appearance. But Jackson wasn't interested in that trade. His self-respect wasn't for sale. As the dust settled in the studio that morning, everyone involved knew they'd just witnessed something significant. Not because it was planned or scripted, but because it was real. Two people having a genuine conflict, with genuine emotions and genuine consequences. The makeup artists who'd worked with Jackson before the interview felt terrible. They'd sent him out there thinking it would be routine, having no idea what George had planned. The camera operators had captured every moment, every facial expression, every word. They'd done their jobs professionally, but some of them felt uncomfortable about being part of what had essentially become a public humiliation attempt that backfired spectacularly. Even the audience members, who'd come expecting a fun morning of celebrity interviews and light entertainment, left the studio that day with a story they'd be telling for years. They'd seen something raw and unfiltered, something that reminded them that beneath all the polish and production of television, there were still real people with real feelings. George sat in his dressing room, and for the first time in a long time, he had to really look at himself. Not the image he projected on camera, not the persona he'd cultivated, but the actual person beneath all that. And what he saw wasn't pretty. He saw someone who'd become so comfortable in his position of power that he'd forgotten basic human decency. He saw someone who'd let ratings and relevance concerns override his better judgment. He saw someone who'd hurt another person simply because he could. The question was what he would do with that realization. Would he learn from it? Would he change? Or would he double down, blame Jackson, and convince himself that he'd been in the right all along? But that's a question for another time. For now, all that mattered was what had happened in those intense, explosive minutes on the Good Morning America stage. Samuel L. Jackson had walked onto that set as a guest. He'd walked off as a man who'd refused to compromise his dignity. And in doing so, he'd given everyone watching a masterclass in standing up for yourself, even when the cameras are rolling and the whole world is watching. Because at the end of the day, respect isn't something that should be negotiated or bargained for. It's something every person deserves, regardless of their age, their recent box office numbers, or anything else. And when someone tries to take that respect away, sometimes the only appropriate response is to stand up, speak your truth, and walk away. That's exactly what Samuel L. Jackson did. And that's why this moment, this confrontation, this explosive exit became the thing everyone was talking about. Not because it was entertaining in the traditional sense,